Okay, babe. I promise not to talk about historical ethnic groups and ancient wars.
5 minutes later.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the second episode of Drunk History with Graf. This, if you didn't watch the first episode, is a series in which I drink some alcohol and talk about history, starting from the Bronze Age, going all the way up to modern day. Today we are starting just after the Bronze Age collapse in the year about 1000 BC-ish, and we're going to go on possibly for the next 500 years or so. This episode is going to come with its own set of caveats, as well as the ones that we had last episode. Most notably, after the Bronze Age collapse happened, a lot of people stopped recording, so the amount of sources that we have are very limited. But there is one group that did do a lot of recording in this time: the Jews. So a lot of the sources that we have for the stuff that happened here is straight out of the Torah / Old Testament of the Bible. So some of the sources that I have for this have to be taken with a grain of salt, which means a lot of this stuff that we're doing is estimation, trying to fill in the blanks and read between the lines. So, last time we left off, the world looked like this. Most of the established civilizations of the world had crumbled, leaving Iron Age tribes living in the ashes. Again, mostly we're going to focus on the Eastern Mediterranean here. I'm going to touch briefly on China and India here, is that their histories can be summarized fairly commonly. India is, at any given time, either just sort of vibing or being invaded by barbarian nomads from the north, with varying degrees of success. China, at any given time, is either in a single piece, doing okay, slowly decaying, or having shattered into a million pieces and slowly being put back together by the warlords trying to be the emperor. And that's kind of how we're going to leave those countries until something specific happens that means that I have to talk about them. So, we're going to start talking again about the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically the Levant, the Fertile Crescent, the Holy Land, if you will. During the Bronze Age, this area was mostly controlled by either the Egyptian kingdom or the Hittite kingdom. But the people who lived there were not Hittite nor were they Egyptian. They were a variety of different ethnicities. In fact, there were two main ethnic groups that made up the peoples who lived in this area. The first being the Hebrews, the second being the Phoenicians. Now, the story of the Jews, and speaking of this, I'm going to be using the term Jew, Hebrew, and Israelite interchangeably in this series, so please forgive me if there are differences that I'm missing out. The story in the Torah and the Bible goes that after a famine in the Middle East, the Jews moved into Egypt as refugees, where they were encouraged to do so by the Pharaoh's prime minister, who was a certain man of many colours. And there they lived for a while their rights were slowly whittled away by the Pharaoh, who turned them into slaves, until they escaped and went back to the Middle East, to the Promised Land. The validity of this story is not entirely known. Most people connect the Pharaoh, that is, of this story to Ramses II, who is just before the Bronze Age collapse. But we're pretty sure that the Jews were there for a little longer than that, so we're not immediately going to throw out this story just yet, but we're pretty sure it doesn't happen exactly as a lot of people say it did. So that leaves the two main ethnic groups of the Middle East, the Phoenicians and the Jews, more or less in the same place. Jews usually further to the south, and the Phoenicians usually further up the coast. But at this time, it was just after the Bronze Age collapse, so there were new boys in town now. One of the peoples who took part in the destruction of the Bronze Age civilizations also came to settle in this area. And their name, while known to history, I can't remember, but we know them by the name that the Jews gave them, the Philistines. And they came to settle along the coast of the Levant, and where they came into contact with the Jews and with the Phoenicians. And now the Bible and the Torah, they like to present the Philistines as being big main enemies of the Jews. And this is kind of... The Jews and the Philistines did fight, but the amount of time in which there was war with the Philistines is much shorter than the amount of time that there was peace. And there was also a significant amount of trade between the Philistines and the Jews, So they're not quite the big bad that religious figures might make them out to be, or as our culture would suggest. I also have to talk about the Phoenicians, because these guys, I have to talk about them. They're quite an important people. Is that after the Bronze Age collapse, they start spreading out quite a lot and becoming involved in the new global or local trade quite a lot. And they are most well known for one product only, and that is purple dye. Purple dye in the West is extremely expensive before synthetic dyes are invented in the 19th century. So much so that it gets associated with royalty, with prestige, with wealth, more than anything else. Because it's extremely difficult to get and difficult to produce. The Phoenicians were one of the only peoples who really had it down. So anywhere you had purple dye, it was probably bought from a Phoenician. The Phoenicians trace their origin to what is in modern-day Lebanon, and Lebanon considers a lot of its heritage to be based on the Phoenicians. So just keep that in mind. Also bear in mind that while I use the label Punic on the map, and you guys might recognize that from a little later in history, with that is the tag that Rome used to call the Carthaginians. Well, keep that in mind because that's not an accident. The Phoenicians also had a variety of different names. Most notably, the Jews referred to them as the Canaanites. The mythology being that the second generation of humans, which was Cain and Abel, had their own set of kids, and that the Jews were the descendants of Abel, and the Canaanites were the descendants of Cain. Again, science doesn't exactly back this up, but that's not particularly important. The religious stories that come out of the Bible and the Torah, they're not meant to be a perfect recreation of history. They're meant to be the foundation of a religious culture. As for the Philistines, as they were a recent arrival, they had a very different culture from those around them. Most notably, their culture was much more similar to those from the old Mycenaean states. However, they adopted local languages and local religions. It is most notable that the Philistines worshipped the same gods as the Canaanites, as the Phoenicians. They also spoke a very similar language, both being a Semitic language, as almost all of them were at the time. The Jews, or should I say Israelites in this instance, also I think we should not immediately jump to the conclusions as them being the same as they are today. It was at this time that the Jewish religion as we know it was just starting to be established. In fact, there is a very entertaining anecdote from when Moses has just come down from Mount whichever it is, having received the Ten Commandments, and he goes down and finds a bunch of Jews doing a sacrifice to Moloch or something. It's one of the Phoenician gods, and he gets angry at them. So, while today the Jewish identity is strongly a religious one, it's very, very heavily tied to the Jewish monotheistic religion, back then it was not. Being a Jew did not mean worshipping a single god. Jews were polytheists as well. Although the modern Jewish religion as we know it was getting much, much stronger in this time. It is about this time that the Jews start getting into serious conflict with the Philistines. Because although the Phoenicians, they were a relatively peaceful lot, they did a lot of trading and not a lot of fighting. The Philistines, on the other hand, had got where they were by conquering and fighting. And essentially they were a warrior elite class ruling over a bunch of local Phoenicians that they had conquered. So when it came time for the Jewish tribes who lived in the area to try to unite, to try and elect a king to rule them all and unite them into one single entity, that brought them into conflict with the Philistines. And this is where a very interesting biblical story comes up, because this is where King Saul comes into this, the first king of the Jews. He is attempting to unite the Jewish tribes into one single nation so that he can go and fight the Philistines, pretty much. And the Philistines knew this, so they assembled an army and went up to go and face off with the Jews. And the Jews, under King Saul, go and assemble their own army, and they go to meet them. And something very curious happens. The Philistines offer a chance to the Jews to win the battle in single combat. I.e., instead of having the entire Jewish army fight the entire Philistine army, the Philistines would put forward a champion to go and fight for them, and the Jews would put forward a champion to fight for them, and it would be a one-on-one duel, and whoever won The other side had to go home, and they would declare the winner. And the Philistines put forward a gigantic 7-foot-tall man named Goliath. Yes, this is where this story happens. When I was in church, when I was very young, I got told the story of David and Goliath. But when they told me, they fucked it up, and they told it wrong. To me, the story of David and Goliath was that a small, I guess, village, group of people, tribe maybe, were just sort of, doing their regular thing when they were being terrorized by this gigantic 30-foot-tall giant named Goliath. And no one was willing to stand up to this gigantic bully. And eventually, one day, this tiny shepherd boy named David gets up with his sling and goes and inexplicably conquers the giant and saves the valley and fucking makes everything peaceful again and becomes the hero. That's not what happened. Not even remotely. It was done as a part of a big political thing that I wouldn't have understood when I was 7 years old. And that's why they explained it in a fucked up way. But this is how the battle between David and Goliath comes. Is that Goliath is the Philistine champion, a giant of a man, but not a giant he's still human. He's still very much human. But this presents the Jews with a very interesting problem, because they don't have anyone who's 7 foot tall, and if they go up against Goliath, he's gonna kill them, and they'll lose the battle. So, King Saul does the only thing that he can think of, and sends for one of his relatives. If I remember correctly. This might actually be wrong, but this is what I remember, after having done some research, is that Saul calls for one of his relatives, who didn't want to get into the whole king business. Little shepherd called David. And he brings his sling, and he gets set up against Goliath. And the battle happens, Goliath is slain, and the Jews win the battle. I have to take a moment here actually to talk about military tactics and the like. Military historian, hi. But it's very common for people to assume that David managed to do this by a miracle, that he stood no chance. That a simple boy with a sling against a giant dude, possibly in armor with a sword and a shield, stood no chance. But that is to completely misrepresent the reality of weaponry and tactics at the time. The sling is a much more potent weapon than people give it credit for. It really was the firearm of the day, more so even than the bow and arrow. Especially when it was in the hand of someone who had trained and used it for a very long time, which David had. For someone who has trained for a very long time in the sling, they can make it pinpoint accurate. And you can put all sorts of different things in this sling. Sometimes it's rocks, but more common in a military context, which they were used in a military context, absolutely. It's little balls of lead, not too dissimilar from musket balls. Although usually a fair bit larger. And so these have a fairly decent range. They are not particularly inaccurate because the people using them tend to have trained for years and years and years. And this is a gigantic lead ball moving extremely fast. That's a deadly weapon. That's a weapon of war. Goliath was the one that didn't stand a chance. In fact, there are whole ethnic groups, whole peoples, who were extremely well known for their use of the sling. Most notably in the classical era, when Rome was all the rage, there was a tribe of people who lived in what's now the Balearic Islands in Spain, and they were extremely proficient with the sling, so much so that they were recruited in masses to be slingers in the Roman army, and they were devastatingly effective. Throughout history, the development of the military pretty much boils down to a competition between the four main arms of the military, and these are cavalry, artillery, infantry, and fortifications. I'm not going to count ships in this because they can basically function as all four, but depending on what kind of area you're looking at, different units will fulfill one of these four roles, usually one of the first three. Fortifications is just fortifications. And the meta of war, the way warfare changed, would basically depend on the relationship between these three different categories. So, in the Bronze Age, it was extremely cavalry heavy. The chariot, which filled the role of cavalry, dominated the battlefield and could destroy just about any infantry. And for centuries after this as well, I'm just going to note this here, artillery doesn't become a major battlefield force until gunpowder. Up until gunpowder, artillery remains pretty much exclusively counter-fortification. Anything up until gunpowder, artillery doesn't take place in pitched battles, only really in sieges. So that's scratched off straight away. But the relationship between these different things will completely change the way a war is fought. A war in which cavalry is dominant tends to be very fast. A war in which artillery or fortifications are dominant tends to be a very slow defensive-based war. A war in which infantry and cavalry are both dominant tends to be a much more offensively based war. At the moment, at time of recording, war is very, very heavily weighted in favour of artillery. Because at current time, the role of artillery is fulfilled by strike aeroplanes. And they really do dominate the battlefield. But that's now, we're talking about then. Back then, the chariot at this point was starting to, well, go out of favour in favour of just regular horsemen, as we know them today, with spears. But the infantry was also not too far behind now that they had iron weapons. Right, back away from the meta of warfare, we're going to go back now to the Middle East, as the tribes of Israel are united, and thanks to the battle against Goliath, have positioned themselves to be an ascendant power in the region greater than that of the Philistines. David takes over the kingdom of Israel, which promptly splits in two. Yeah, that didn't take long, did it? For a variety of mostly political reasons, which I can't quite recall, the kingdom ends up splitting into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, here and here respectively. Now, the biblical narrative is kind of a bit weird, but basically it suggests that the northernmost kingdom was a lot more religiously tolerant, shall we say. They supported and promoted Yahweh worship, the modern Jewish religion, but they also allowed for the Canaanite religion, which was a polytheistic religion to be practiced by the people in the area. According to the religious sources, because of this, God just sort of lets it be conquered, and what ends up happening is, at about this time, a new empire rises out of Mesopotamia, from a city that had done this before, Babylon. So Babylon starts getting a lot more powerful, and they start getting quite conquery, and they conquer most of Mesopotamia, and down into the Middle East. And they end up in, this time, conquering Israel and Judah. And this is where an event called the Babylonian exile happens. Now, although this is, written down in religious sources, this is something which is considered to truly have happened. A huge amount of the Jewish elite gets basically kidnapped and brought into Babylon as slaves, where they stay for quite a significant amount of time. Now, we're going to leave Israel and Judah for a moment, and we're going to head north and east to a region of the world that we today know as Iran or Persia, but back then had a very, very different name. In fact, so different that we aren't entirely sure what it is now. Nevertheless, in our modern day, this is Iran or Persia. That was not how it was back then. Back then, this was Iran or Persia. Because the Iranians, or Persians, I'm just going to leave it at Persians for the moment. The Persians were originally a nomadic horse tribe who ended up conquering this area just after the Bronze Age collapse. But the majority of this area was dominated by an ethnic group called the Medes. And no, these are not a group of extremely tasty honey-based alcoholic beverages. It was its own Iranic ethnic group. The Medes conquered out a whole empire in the area in basically most of what is today Iran, as well as parts of Armenia and Iraq. This is where some very strange things happen. According to the source that we have at the time, there is a prophecy that some rando is going to come and take over the empire, which, interestingly enough, is actually something that happens quite a lot in this part of the world. The legendary figure Sargon of Akkad, who happened way before this in the Bronze Age, he's also basically this exact same story. But this story specifically says that the empire will be conquered and overthrown by a Persian. Anyway, this rando was a man who, I don't know his real name, but he was named by the Greeks Cyrus. And just as the prophecy said, he ended up conquering the Median Empire and establishing his own family, the House of Achaemenid, as the ruler of the new empire. Now, the empire that was formerly owned by the Medes was now owned and controlled by a Persian, and so is the start of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty. And Cyrus decides he's going to do some conquering of his own. Cyrus is a very well-liked figure in the historical record, because he treated people remarkably well for a person of his time. He's known as being a very just ruler compared to most of the time. And this is also compounded by the fact that pretty much the only people writing at the time were the Jews. And at the time, the Jews were mostly in captivity in Babylon. Cyrus decides he's going to conquer Babylon. And that's exactly what he does. He marches south and takes over most of Mesopotamia. And that means that now the Jews are not under the control of Babylon anymore. And Cyrus basically just bids them to go on home back to Israel, which they do. And for that, he is venerated and he's very well remembered as a friend of the Jews. So the Jews now come home back to Israel, and they realize something extremely strange. There's still a bunch of people there who speak the same language and for the most part practice the same sort of religion. But they've kind of changed things. Things are strange. Before the conquest happened, they built a temple in Jerusalem under King Solomon. And that was the center of the Jewish faith. But everyone that was there suddenly were dissing this. They were calling it bullshit. And they had their own new center of the faith elsewhere. So all of the Jews who'd been in captivity in Babylon, they rushed back into Israel, went back to Jerusalem, founded the seat of their new kingdom back there. But there was a ton of other weird people who basically had completely changed the faith on the basis of you shouldn't have built the temple there, you should have built it somewhere else, so everything that temple has said so far is bullshit. And these people, they gained the name Samaritan. And that's where these people come from, and that is why in the story of the Good Samaritan, it's so strange that the Samaritan helps the Jew, because they are religiously different and they are very antagonistic towards each other because of this. So, why did Cyrus do this? Why did he let the Jews go back home? Well, there's been a variety of reasons. One is likely he was trying to cultivate his personality as being a just and respectful ruler. One of the other things that he's known to have done is to take all of the idols that Babylon looted in their conquest of Mesopotamia and bring them back to the cities where they had been looted from. So it's likely that he was doing this to inspire a cult of personality as a friendly and good-natured guy, which, you know, I think the world would be a lot better if cult of personalities nowadays were still based on that concept, but I digress. The other reason that he's speculated to have done this is to have created a buffer state between himself and Egypt, which is, although Egypt's power was significantly diminished due to the Bronze Age collapse and the invasions of the Sea Peoples, it's still there. It will always be there. The Nile is one of the best places for civilization because it is extremely predictable. It floods every year in very predictable manners, which makes it perfect for agriculture, makes it perfect for irrigation specifically. And because of this, there will always be Egypt. Even if Egypt is not a major power, they will always be. Even though Egypt was no longer a world hegemon, Persia was still wary of it. So a buffer state had to be created. And the Jews, because they were freed from basically slavery, they were always going to be friendly to the Persians. Alright, so the state of the world at the end of this episode looks something like this. I think we're going to round off here. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the newly emerging classical Greece, how it's interacting with the Persian Empire. I think we will see where this is going. And possibly some other stuff. This has been Graf. I will see you next time. Thank you very much.